Good morning and welcome to the Department of Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thank you for joining us today in the auditorium, and also welcome to everybody who's joining us online. My name is Laussen. I'm the division head for pediatric cardiology and the director of the Heart Center. And this lecture this morning is brought to us via the Dr. Annie Terry visiting professorship. Dr. Annie Terry is a retired gastroenterologist who was very invested in education and clinical excellence. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Peter Laussen. Really, if this was a purely cardiac or intensivist audience, then he could commence his talk right away, but because we have a wider audience today, I'll stand between his talk and you for just another minute or so. So Dr. Laussen is originally from Australia. He received his medical degree from the University of Melbourne, or Melbourne, as I was educated to pronounce it. And he actually trained as an anesthesiologist and a pediatric intensivist. In 1992, he was asked to come to Boston and was going to stay for a year, and 20 years later, he was still there. During that time, he really made seminal contributions and is one of the founding fathers, really, of the specialty of pediatric cardiac critical care. He was appointed the division chief for pediatric cardiac critical care there. And in 2012, he was recruited to Toronto to SickKids to be the department chair for critical care medicine. And that's where I had the privilege of working with Dr. Laussen for 7 years or so. There's few people who have made similar impacts to the field. He's trained numerous pediatric cardiac intensivists over the years and has also made very important contributions to research, mostly in the field of predictive modeling for outcomes for critically ill patients after cardiac surgery. And I'm sure we'll hear about some of that today. Dr. Laussen is not a stranger to our program and to our department. In fact, he was here in 2008 as the Caston visiting lecturer, and over the years has helped us with external expert opinions on many of our patients. In order not to leave out important milestones of his career and by way of introducing his topic, I decided to get some help from AI with this, just to make sure I didn't leave anything out. And it was fairly good what I got, but I was surprised to hear that he was also the founding director of the Heart Center for Children at Children's Hospital in Michigan in Detroit. I didn't verify that with you, but I don't think that's right. And I asked that question in a number of different ways, and it still persevered on that fun fact, and also told me that he's actually currently serving as the chief of critical care medicine at Boston Children's Hospital. And while that was true in the past, that is no longer current. So, I then engaged, what I shouldn't have done, I engaged in a discussion with ChatGPT. It's like, Peter Laussen is not in Detroit. And at least, it apologized for the previous error. And it's like, I didn't let it go that easily. I said, why did you think he was in Detroit? And I got this somewhat snotty response of, you can ask me for information, but it's up to you to decide whether it's accurate. And that's obviously one of the problems with AI, that it's very slick, but not always true. I decided to give the bot one more chance and ask it one more question for accuracy. And so I don't know that I fully agree with that response either, but at least I found out that Dr. Brainer has a side gig in Seattle, if it's true. With that, and without any further ado, over to Dr. Peter Laussen for his talk.
Well, thank you very much, Lars. I really appreciate your introduction, and you've just demonstrated the underlying principle to my talk, which is we're not there yet with artificial intelligence, but we're getting closer. I'm sorry. So thank you very much for the invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here. I've had a really fortunate career. I've been privileged in so many ways by the people who train me, the people I've worked with, people I've met across the entire spectrum of pediatrics, pediatric critical care, pediatric anesthesia, and cardiac care. And I see my relationship with Dawn Becker over the last few years as part of that privilege. It's been a privilege to get to know you, to work with you, to develop friendships. And I want to congratulate you on the work that you've been doing. It is impactful. It has made a difference. And while it's hard to see it, I can feel it. I can also see the value that you bring to the care of critically ill children with heart disease. And that's just outstanding. And I just want you to recognize that you are really making a huge impact. So how do we move forward in many of the areas in which we're working right now? How do we avoid being stuck? How do we avoid practicing the way we've practiced for the last 30, 40 years? There are still things we're doing today that I was taught. The way we round, the way we transfer information has changed a lot, and then again it hasn't. And how we adapt, adopt, and utilize information that's coming at us has to be really thought about in a very critical way, because the way we have practiced is not the way we should practice and can continue to practice. We have new generations of clinicians, physicians, nursing coming into delivery of healthcare. I don't want you to practice the way I was taught or the way I practiced. You have to do it in a way that is new, innovative, imaginative, and utilizing all of the data information that's available for you at the bedside. And we have to change the way we educate. We have to change and adapt to different ways to think about the care of patients. We can't be stuck in the last century. And I try not to be. And part of this talk is really how do we get to the meaningful adoption of artificial intelligence, which will be at the forefront of the work that we do and the way we teach and the way we do research. I have disclosures. I'm not going to be talking about them in any great detail. I will mention the tracking trajectory trigger tool that I was a co-developer for visualizing and hosting high-frequency time series physiologic data. But I want to go to one point that when we started this journey nearly 3 years ago, when I spoke with Lars and with Dana, and the outcomes were not what you wanted them to be for children with heart disease at Dawn Becker Children's. The overwhelming feeling at the time was we don't have a big enough volume, and therefore there will always be potential for errors that are unintended, but care that can impact outcome. And that's been the thrust of so much of what we do across pediatrics, I don't care what specialty, and across healthcare in general. It's this volume-dependent outcomes. Well, that question here is how do we get to volume-independent outcomes? And I firmly believe you can do that. And it happens through developing systems of high reliability and clinicians who are highly reliable, who will pay attention to detail, who avoid oversimplification, defer to expertise, listen, communicate, articulate expected pathways, get to the why. We can all do that. There needs to be a framework for collective decision-making and having that questioning attitude, a framework for intervention when the patient's course is not following the expected trajectory, and a framework for collaboration, and that comes through various registries, such as PC4 and STS and the cardiac side, but that's where intelligence and data come in. So if we apply, I think, these 4 principles, we can truly be volume independent. But the conversation continues that there is national variation in congenital surgery outcomes. Let's just take that specific area of where I work. And this came out in 2020 in Circulation by authors that had looked at the STS database over a 3-year period. And you can see within this that if you look at operative mortality, length of stay, and major complications, there was still quite a bit of variability between organizations across the spectrum of those delivering and reporting to the STS. And that variability, I'm not going to go into the details. I'm not going to point out various centers here because I don't think it helps. Each center is different the way they're structured and the systems under which they deliver care. But their perspective was that you needed to have a median annual volume of around 300 cases per year, and that you needed an organized infrastructure and critical mass of highly specialized physicians and surgeons. People matter, for sure, but it's how you work and the system that you create that's, I think, more important, and how you use the data that's in front of you and the decisions that you make. So I don't agree with this, and I'm just one opinion. But I honestly don't think we can exist in a world where we regionalize and we collate all sorts of programs. First of all, our workforce has changed. I'm not going to talk about Robin Horak's paper here, but I did have the chance to review it before, as one of the critical reviewers before it was published. And I want to go to this particular map here that shows all the pediatric critical care centers across the United States and where they're clustered. And they're both pediatric cardiac and pediatric combined intensive care units. And the purpose of the paper was to say, well, where are they now and what's the volume of patients, but what's the staffing changes? And there's certainly been a change in the composition of staffing in these units over the years. But I did ask them to say, can you overlay a population map so we can see where these centers are related to the population? And this is the bottom map here of the states. And just look at the concentration of
There we go.
population.
The worst paper
various,
we've ever had.
Yeah, it's
Thank you. Concentration on the East Coast, centers that are very close. And we've certainly seen in the Northeast that over time it's just made no sense for us to have centers that are dotted around the various states of New England when Boston Children's is sitting right there. And so that concentrate, and we can actually get patients to us most of the time. If you look in the Northwest, it's a different story. We've got Seattle and Portland here. Very important populations, very important services that need to be delivered. And to think that we can just sort of dislocate or combine centers and expect patients, families, resources to travel with them, in this day and age, I think is unrealistic. That's the variability related to cardiac surgery. What's the variability related to the care we provide in intensive care? And that's really hard to get at because it does have an impact on outcomes. I am certain that there are decisions I have made over the years in intensive care about patients with critical illness that have led to harm, unintentionally. And I can see 2 or 3 patients in my mind right now as I talk to you where I wish I'd made a different decision or gone a different pathway. The variability by which we practice in critical care was demonstrated to me in this paper by Francesca and John Kerr out of Boston Children's, where they actually looked at hard data from 5 centers: Boston Children's, Texas, Colorado, Lurie Children's, and CHOP, and basically went through the EMRs of those patients. Not surprisingly, there was some variability here in things like length of stay, both the ICU and the hospital, survival and survival to discharge, survival at 30 days and at discharge was no different between these 5 centers. But they got there with different pathways expressed by length of stay. And length of stay is a poor surrogate to me as to how we provide care and the variability of care. And what they did was they broke out in these 5 centers various components to the care in intensive care. And these are the 5 centers, and these are their care curves. And this is, let's take center A here. The dark line is the median. The darker areas here, the 25th to 75th percentiles. And I'm not going to go through the various aspects of this, except to say you can see the variability in the way in which we manage fluids in these 5 centres, in children's, all following the same procedure, which was stage 1 palliation for hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Their opioid use was quite different, and their ventilation, duration of ventilation, also quite different across the centres, and quite substantial differences in their confidence intervals. You can make some judgment here and say, look, Centre A got to a negative fluid balance earlier, they used much less opioid, and they had a much shorter duration of mechanical ventilation. All of that makes sense. Why can't that be achieved across all centres? What is it that's different about our approach to the drugs that we're giving, diuretics and opioids, and the way in which we ventilate? So there is one way that we can start to get at that perhaps, and that's with this PC4 consortium, which was started by Michael Gayers and his team at CS Mott in Michigan. And that registry has become a really important source of information by which we can share information between all centres providing cardiac critical care. And in 2019, Michael and his team described an improvement in outcomes simply by this inter-hospital collaboration. And that membership of PC4 enabled reductions in mortality, complications, length of stay, duration, mechanical ventilation. Doesn't tell us why, doesn't get to causality. The care curves that John Curran that I just showed you perhaps start to show you some of the factors, and that's the next step, is the type of data that we're putting into our registries and how we can actually start to get to causality rather than benchmarks. Remember, this is comparative data, provides shared learning and research, but doesn't really determine causality, and I don't think it really helps us minimize variability. But this type of data matters. This type of data falls under this prognostic enrichment category. It's transactional data seen in registries, seen in the electronic health record in EPIC, and it's often focused on a population or an event of patients. As I said, it's comparative. It helps us share, communicate, and trend risks. Very useful for operational and business performance, provides those benchmarks and outcomes, but does not get to what I think is the underlying reason for variability, and that's the decisions we make and the teams we create and the systems in which we work. And Michael and Sarah Pasquale looked at this further when they were on this, using the PC4 data to determine whether or not they could actually, whether they were measuring all the factors that contributed to our outcomes, in this case mortality. And not surprisingly, the ones in this table here came out as the principal factors explaining mortality in children undergoing congenital heart surgery. This is not new information. Known this for 20 plus years. Every paper that looks at outcomes comes up with these exact 7 types of factors. But what they were able to demonstrate is that it doesn't explain everything and that there are these unmeasured factors, patient factors. There are also system level and team level factors that are not incorporated in this data. And what we need to do is get to another component to the data. So there's the prognostic enrichment, and now there's the predictive enrichment. And that's where we start to look at the biologic responses of patients to illnesses and treatment. Looking at the physiologic data, the biomarkers, the omics, all of which is now available, increasingly available, and will be able to be utilized online to support the decisions we make. And that my focus over the last 10 years has really been trying to understand the physiologic state of a patient and the risk for an event within that state. Rather than the risk for an event, I want to understand what's driving to that event. And this starts to get to individualized or precise critical care. It may help us with causality, but it's usually with inference because we don't capture our decisions at the bedside. Blood pressure goes down, you look at the EMR, you've given 10 cc per kilo of albumin or you've increased epinephrine infusion, blood pressure comes up. We infer that the patient was hypovolemic or they needed a little bit more squeeze to drive that pressure up. It may not be the case at all. And it may be that there was a different thinking going on, and what you were trying to do was to temporize the circumstance, get the blood pressure up to maintain organ perfusion, while you then sort out the contributing factors to that low blood pressure. But that sort of discussion, the way we think, just doesn't get captured, and yet it's really important. And there may be things that you decided not to do that are equally important. You may not have decided to add norepinephrine to increase afterload because that would make your AV valve regurgitation worse, right? Capturing that type of decision is really important too. We don't do it well enough. The EMR doesn't allow us to do it. The solution to that is perhaps related to the chat bots that are increasingly out there. I personally think we should be getting away with keyboards and everything should be voice activated, and we should be able to just be talking to the EMR and capturing our conversations and what we think. Another discussion. But this combined prognostic and predictive enrichment strategies was really, it's not my idea. This came through Hector Wong, who unfortunately passed away last year. Hector was just one of those iconic people within the field of pediatric critical care. He made such seminal discoveries at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And he really, this is looking at septic shock and the responsiveness to corticosteroids, and he was able to demonstrate that if you take not only that categorical transactional data, you combine it with the biologic data, so the prognostic and the predictive enrichment, you could actually start to determine which patients were going to respond appropriately to steroids in septic shock. That type of work is what we need to continue to see occurring in our field. Now, if you look at where we are right now with intelligence in critical care, there are numerous pieces and viewpoints published on deep learning and the potential to transform healthcare. We all agree with that. I went back and looked at just manuscripts in PubMed that reference artificial intelligence over the last, well, since 1997. And you can see that in the last 2 decades, there's been just a huge increase. Not surprising, right? And for machine learning, which is really the last decade, we've really started to see that type of analysis of data come into our decision-making and publications. And of course, we are aware of it in everyday life. You can see the exponential increase as well. Well, I can tell you that less than 0.1% of this has made it to routine clinical care. And there are many reasons for that. First, we have multiple problems to solve. Second, we need to understand the problems, first of all, and make sure that the machine learning is actually helping us solve the problem as we understand it and perhaps give us new understanding. Access to data is extremely limited, both internal and external access. And there are lots of reasons around security, privacy, that I understand for that. But systems are now improving and rapidly improving. And that, I think, will be the big change we see in the next decade, is that the architecture for bringing in data is going to change completely. And it's going to be at the bedside. And it's going to be a way in which we can have huge data lakes and networks that are connected very quickly and seamlessly that will allow us to bring data into decision making. The other aspect to this is how are we going to work with it? Because it's no point having all this intelligence in the data if we don't use it and our systems don't allow us to use it. So the way I frame this is that we need to look at our systems of care, the macro systems, how we work, how we deliver care, both at a local, institutional, and across healthcare, and how that system really enables us to deliver the care that needs to be delivered, and that we are provided with the tools and the technology to do so. That's the way in which we need to be thinking. Now, I look at highly reliable systems, and this is Boston Children's Hospital. We are compliant. We're a compliant system. We're like the lung, right? So any unit change in pressure results in a unit change in volume. And so the change in volume per unit change in pressure, I'm sorry, let me get the right way to phrase that. And I say that because our pressure of patients needing to come into the system, whether it be behavioral health, viral illnesses, COVID, whatever the pressures are, our response is to try and create capacity, is to try and make sure that we can have the access, the right flow, the right rate of change. And that's been our focus. We try to expand out all the time. And we put incredible pressure on our systems, but more so, incredible pressure on our teams and the people within with that attitude. So I don't believe that our system should be like the lung. I work in the cardiac field. We need to be more like the myocardium. We need to be elastic. Elastance, the inverse of compliance, is where we should be. And what's our change in pressure per unit change in volume? So when we've got a volume of patients that are coming into our system, what are the pressures that we need to change to enable that? And that means you need to contract and relax. It means you need to look at your afterload, your downstream pressures, discharge practices, care at home, those types of things. And you need to look at, I think, one of the most fundamental aspects about the myocardium and what determines elastance, and that's the ability of myocardial fibers to pull on each other, to overlap and pull on each other. That togetherness is what we need to do. And when we have a compliant system that continues to expand, we stretch beyond that. We lose that ability. And I don't care what size of program you have. It applies equally across all sizes. So that's the way I view it in my role as EVP of Health Affairs. That's the way I view it when I work in the intensive care unit. That togetherness, that is the fundamental function of myofibrils to overlap and work and pull on each other, is what we need to get to. Now, we need to be able to map and measure the system very well. We need to look at complexity, all the moving pieces. We have focused initiatives across Boston Children's, for example, that are impacting our internal and external relationships, certainly affecting our capacity management, access, and so forth. Important to appreciate that none of this is sequential. There are multiple moving pieces, and then you add on things like we've got a huge research strategic plan. We're just about to launch a new education strategic plan that we're going to invest in, and we're creating risks within our system all the time. You need to be able to measure that. And then here's what I think is really critical, is getting to psychological safety. Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School is the person I think who has really helped understand this. And the psychological safety is really our ability to speak up. It's our ability to look at the risk within our system and within our delivery of care and focus on that without worrying about the risk to us. We're taken care of. We know that we're supported. We know somebody has our back. We know that we can speak up and be listened to. That psychological safety, if you have that in an organization, you can do amazing things. And I don't think we have that at Boston Children's at all well defined. We try very hard to do it, but we have work to do. It's a moving target. And it's not about people transforming. It's not about people adapting. It's about systems adopting change and being prepared to make that change with their network and the connections they have, and then how they execute on that. Another point I'm going to make here relates to variability of practices and how we adapt to uncertainty. And this is work that I did at Sick Kids with Patricia Trowbridge, who is just a wonderful human factors engineer and expert researcher at the University of Toronto. And we developed this through a number of studies in our critical care unit, this sort of grid, in that how people were working within our pediatric intensive care unit, but it actually fits for me in almost all the areas that I work, including being the senior physician at Boston Children's Hospital. There's work that we do that is standard work, that's consistent and reproducible. Checklist work in that regard, CPGs, protocols, they all work in that framework. Low uncertainty, don't need to adapt, we just do it. In the intensive care unit of sick kids, when we studied this, we were in that space only 25% of the time. And yet we were expecting checklists to make it 100% of the time would make us work really well. You have to apply those tools in the right environments. Rigidity is where there is a lot of uncertainty, but we're not changing our behaviors or adapting. That's the risk for harm, and that's a very small percentage in our units, including Dornbecker, including Boston Children's, sick kids. But the way in which we can appreciate this and that we are being rigid is by using data appropriately, and in particular, that's where artificial intelligence is important. Resilience is a really important area where we respond and recover patients, and you do that extraordinarily well. You do that through your training, immersive simulation. But once again, data and the use of AI will really help us appreciate the need to respond and track how the patient's recovering. This system here, this system of variability is actually really important because that's what I call the learning system, but it's where workarounds occur. It's pretty standard work, we think, and yet people are doing things in a different way. Now, it's been called illegal normal, normalized deviance. It's termed, reference of it implies that people are doing something wrong. I don't actually think that's the case. Very few times do I see people doing something wrong. What they're doing is adapting to a system, a situation in which they are placed or their team is placed, that they just have to make that shift and change. Or, and this is not uncommon, people have found a better way to do the work. So we need to capture that. And a true learning system to me is when we actually have that lens, where we're looking at why deviations occur and capture it. And that's a fundamental aspect of human behavior. So we recently moved into, June last year, into a new clinical tower called the Hale Building. And one of the metrics we chose to really track when we moved across was, what are the workarounds? What are people now being forced to do that they previously didn't do in a new building, double the size of footprint we used to have and so forth? There was a lot. There was a lot. And it proved to us we just couldn't translate a system that existed before into a new environment and expect that system just to dock straight in. We had to think about it better. All right, so I've given you a lot of background as to where I think we're heading and some of the aspects. Well, artificial intelligence, how do I get to the A in intelligence? Well, we all know artificial intelligence. The definitions here, there's the general AI, which is the capacity to perform human intelligence by machines and to extrapolate to tasks that weren't explicitly programmed, right? We are automated cars on the way there, but we're not there. In healthcare, we're not there at all. It doesn't exist yet, but it's getting there. And there are experts in this field who are predicting we will be there, one by 2029 in healthcare, others predicting in the 2030s. That's the pace at which things are rapidly progressing. Machine learning and deep learning are really just methodologies within artificial intelligence to look at the data. I'm not going to spend time talking about the components of machine learning, other than that it's the value of the output from the machine learning is entirely dependent on the input. And if we don't get the right inputs, the output you'll get will not be believable or actionable. People often say to me, well, I don't understand how the result comes out. Well, I don't either. And in fact, I don't think anybody understands how a deep learning technique that is applied to data actually, what techniques or how the machine is actually making those relationships and assignments within. There's not a mathematical model to which it fits. It's not like the Bayesian model that we've been talking about with T3, for instance. That I can understand. There's mathematical modeling behind that. Our task and our trouble with deep learning is that we're trying to explain it. And I'm trying to move beyond explainability to one of, is the output believable within, does it make sense to me? How does it add to the complexity of care that I need to deliver? And it's the human that has to make that decision. Let's take another industry that uses machine learning real time, and talk about actually NASCAR. They have a huge amount of data streaming from those vehicles, just a massive amount, and they're going to continually analyzing every aspect of that machine and its performance. And the pit crew and the lead is then feeding that back to the driver all the time. Probably equally as important is the observer sitting on the top of the stands with binoculars, who is watching that car in relationship to all the other cars around them and telling the driver where they are. And if you watch NASCAR, these drivers are right up against each other. There's no margin for error. That person is receiving data and and also looking at the position of the driver, feeds that to the driver, but the driver decides. Nobody else trumps the driver. The person holding that wheel decides, and that's what's going to happen in healthcare. We will decide, because it's our job to do all that. Our problem is there's just too much information that we try to force through our brains. So the machine learning is going to be a way in which we can control a lot of that noise, although beware, it may just add another lot of noise that you have to try and interpret as well. So artificial intelligence and machine learning, I don't use the word artificial intelligence anymore. It can also be referred to assisted, augmented, or automatic intelligence, where assisted with our simple tasks requires constant human interaction. Augmented, where it's supporting our decisions rather than independent intelligence. And then finally, the automated intelligence that perhaps gives us new knowledge and wisdom. That's the journey that intelligence perhaps travels along. We're at the assisted intelligence stage, I think, if I had to make that assessment right now. But the question is that enough? Because there's no value in having huge amounts of data and methods and techniques to interrogate and analyze that data if it's not going to be adopted, if it's not going to be used to the care of patients, for the decisions we make, and within the systems we create. So there are different ways that I think that we look at it. And at Boston Children's, we have made the deliberate choice of saying we have an aligned intelligence. And that alignment is of data and all the myriad of data sources, but in particular, alignment of people with that data. Bringing people who understand the data together, but bringing the people who will use that to get data together as well. So we've shifted to aligned intelligence platform rather than an AI platform. My journey here started in 1992 in Boston Children's, and this little guy here had undergone an arterial switch procedure. This is the early era of pediatric cardiac critical care. And I think it's of value to know exactly what it was like at that time. We didn't have any of the technology that's used today. We were using adult ventilators. We were using different types of ventilator settings, accounting for the fact that we couldn't measure tidal volumes accurately, peak pressures accurately. We had a lot of devices at the bedside. We had ECMO, we had VADS, we had all of this, but we couldn't actually capture or utilize that information very well. At the same time, there were dramatic and huge changes. We started to understand the stress response, endothelial injury, pulmonary hypertension, neurologic injury, low cardiac output states. A lot of that started to appear as this era of neonatal cardiac surgery took hold. And we were at the very early era of data accumulation. So we had, the internet was in its infancy, but we had a lot of add-ons, a lot of tools that were developed, some of them DOS-based, but they were best-in-breed type era, where somebody would develop a cool algorithm or software that we could, and it was usable at the bedside, but we couldn't store the data because the CPUs were just incapable of doing it. They weren't fast enough, they didn't have enough power, storage. So data was lost. But at least at the bedside, there were some of these tools that we could utilize. And in fact, by 2005, we'd rapidly changed, so over the period of these next decade, into different technologies that were generating huge amounts of information. And we'd shifted in that period of time from taking all of these pieces of software to now the electronic health record. And that's the birth of Cerner and Epic and a number of others that have since no longer popular. But so we started to now take data, but it was still categorical information. The continuous physiologic data that we see at the bedside wasn't captured at all, just was lost. And we only collected a certain amount of categorical data. When I went to Sick Kids in 2012, we started a program called Artificial Intelligence in Medicine. And I think Sick Kids has been very intentional about this, and it started at the top with the CEO, Ronnie Cohen, saying, we are going to move to precise, individualized care. That was the number one strategic goal that he set forth. And as soon as he did that, all the barriers that existed between research and clinical AI, IT, between siloed groups that had data, melted away. Because now the mandate was, we're going to take everything and use it and bring people together. And that was a really important thing to do. It also built on something that Sick Kids had done in 1993. Apple Magazine, which no longer exists, but Apple News, named Sick Kids as the hospital of the future. And it was named that because John Edmonds in Pediatric ICU connected 8 Mac computers. This is in 1993. 8 little small Mac box computers. I forget the name of them now. Dana, you might remember, but connected them all into sort of a little Macintosh and a little network. None of the data was connected, but he was able to develop, to me, what is the first EMR in critical care. You could see the order entry, you could see the ventilation status, fluid management, it was all there. None of it was saved because the CPUs were so weak we couldn't collect it, but you could at least pull it up and see it. And the other thing that was very important as we start to develop the use of big data for actionable intelligence is the teams we create within our unit. Our fields are going to shift. This is a team that got embedded into Sick Kids critical care. There are physicians, nursing, physicists, data scientists, computer engineers, all coming together, working in the same environment, but with a focus on bringing the data to the bedside. And the important thing for the people who are managing that data and using that data and the modeling of it, they needed to see where it was going and what the impact was. So we need to bring new generations, but also new teams into our environment to really make this work. In 2022, at Boston Children's, we developed we opened this Hale building. This is amazing, huge, everything that opens and shuts. It's a fabulous building. But we had to then also do our own aligned intelligence because we created a great space and then we created other problems. Line of sight, ability to connect and communicate, ability to see the same things. I can be, in this particular, this is a view down one of the corridors on the cardiac intensive care unit, which is 2 floors, 48 beds, and we've just lost that line of sight, that line of connection. And if we're going to use data to help us with a better assessment of the information that's available to us, then we have to understand how it will fit into these type of workflows. And that's part of the aligned intelligence at the bedside that we've started at Boston Children's. And our goal is really the EMR is simply just a source of information. It is not the artificial intelligence platform. It sits there, and now we have brought into it our research computing, all of the omics. We've brought into it with our labs and all of the metabolomics. And I actually think the metabolomics is that next really important stage, the change that we make in pediatric cardiac critical care, that we really start to understand the metabolic effect of the care that we provide. But we're creating a different platform. And yeah, we're going to go to Epic in June next year. We're currently a Cerner shop and plan now to go to Epic, which will improve our interoperability. We're an island of Cerner and a sea of Epic right now. And that's great. It's going to give us advantages, but it's not our intelligence platform. It's our source of data, of categorical data. And there are other tapestries of information that we need to bring in. And this tapestry, I really like that analogy. Ken Mandel at Boston Children's was the one that created that. And we start to get to what is really now going to be adaptable intelligence, where the data is not going to be, we're not going to have our traditional research models of hypothesis-driven biomedical research. We've got a hypothesis, we'll do a set of experiments and analyze in that loop. We're going to be shifting to a data-driven platform here where we've got data that will be annotated, that we develop the model, do the simulations, biologic simulations and decision-making. That is all where we will be heading. And I think that's an important shift for us to make, and it's one that will change the way in which we practice and the systems that we use. This system in critical care is a wraparound right now, and this is an example for me that what we know at admission, what we know at discharge, and all of the aspects that we create to support the care of that patient. And then these nodes here are just the decision nodes. We bounce around in our decisions, right? And nursing staff will tell you that best at the bedside. Comments that will be made like well, what is it that you like? Or we'll get to know, when I started back at Boston Children's, one of the nurses said to me, "Oh, it's good to see you back. We know what you like." I said, "It's actually not what I like. It's what the patient needs, and that's what we should." But that's the way it works, right? And you can see a shift in our team and a shift in decisions being made. And is that practice variability? I think it's biologic variability. And particularly in critical care, it's essential that we be able to understand that and appreciate it. And we capture all the data. If you look at physiologic data in the ICU, this is at Boston Children's. We have now got, just on our T3 platform, 13.5 million hours of data on 150,000 patients. That's an incredibly rich source of information and data to then analyze and put into machine learning models. At Sick Kids, we've been collecting since April 2016 every waveform, every bit of data, every data point, and now have just on 5 trillion data points stored. And we had to create a pathway that enabled that, which was a platform where we could account for the bottlenecks in the data streaming from the patient to the architecture that we created. But also then to have an architecture that allows you to get at the data. There's no point storing it and not being able to access it. So the decompression, rapid recompression components are incredibly important if we're going to use this type of information in a meaningful way. And there's no off-the-shelf product to do this. We've developed it, guys at Sick Kids developed this, and it's incredibly powerful. But it's the type of example to me that we don't appreciate. We like to see the output of the machine learning, but if we don't get the inputs right, then the output is going to mislead us. And then the other aspect about this is how do we manage artifacts? Artifactual intelligence. Look at the arterial line here. These are just 20 different ways in which that arterial line can show artifacts. We can categorize these artifacts. We can write algorithms that will allow them to be labeled within a data set. But we all know that if there's a lot of artifacts streaming into a model, it's going to create bias. It's also about time. We don't pay enough attention to it, but the timing of signals in critical care are really important if you're going to put them into a model. They have to be aligned within microseconds at least, because otherwise the machine's going to misinterpret it. How we manage time is important to avoid the bias and the artifacts that we create. And then finally, appreciating the variability in our signals is important as well. If you just look at an EMR and look at 4-hour intervals, you will see little variability in a signal, in a number in that unit, in that EMR. If you then use that data for whatever study that you're doing, it actually doesn't give you any idea as to what the variability of that signal has been. The variability of a signal is an indicator of health. It's also an indicator of illness. If you lose variability in a physiologic signal, that's often an indication of a change in illness. Recovery of variability is in fact indicating a recovery from illness. And that's a normal physiologic state that we don't appreciate. Being able to capture that variability is really, really critical. And the EMR doesn't allow for that. How do we apply the data? Well, this is an example of saying, okay, we've got a lot of information coming at us. This is a population of patients undergoing transposition of the great artery surgery of sick kids. And we can look at their heart rate and systolic blood pressure for that entire population, and we understand what the ranges could be. But if you look at an individual patient, these red lines here, it's actually quite different. For individual patients, they keep a much narrower range for their signal. We all do. As a population of older white guys, I know what my range of blood pressure is going to be in that population, but I know that I keep mine physiologically at a much tighter range than the population. And that is a big impact on the decisions we make at the bedside, but we're not capturing it. So it's more information that we need to apply. We need to look at things like the dose of exposure to a particular physiologic state. This is an example of IDO2, inadequate oxygen delivery, and the duration of exposure to a state and the risk for an event like cardiac arrest. And then finally, what are the associations between various data points? This is a study out of sick kids as well by Jessica Nickel that looked at 77 children that had undergone the arterial switch procedure or stage 1 for single ventricle palliation. And looking at the risk for new MRI injury 9 days post-surgery. All these children got a pre-op MRI and then a post-op MRI. And you can see that, at least in the single ventricle group, there was a 40% risk of new findings, 30% in the transposition group. Bypass and whatever care we provide in the ICU can cause injury. We don't understand that particularly well, and we try to look at particular signals. Was it blood pressure, heart rate, SpO2? We couldn't find anything. And in fact, when we interrogated all of the signals, there was not one particular signal that enabled us to understand what was going on, but rather when we applied first principle component analysis, we could actually see that low oxygen saturation, high blood pressure, high heart rate were in fact all associated with the risk for new neurologic injury. Now, it gives us some insights and perhaps things we need to avoid, but at the same time, it doesn't tell us what to do or how we can modify it. That information needs to come down the track, but I think it's this relationship between signals in critical care that's really important, and that's where we've got the data. It's how we analyze it and use it to provide us with new intelligence that's important. And it's going to lead to this. I think this is the next form of monitoring. We're actually looking real-time the relationship between blood pressure, heart rate, and saturation. And we're going to see perturbations that will result in a graphical display real-time as to, once again, it's not telling you what to do, it's saying, hey, there's a problem. So the alignment of data and intelligence is, I've talked a lot about the data and the problems that we need to address in that regard. The models we create need to be reliable, relevant, representable, replicable. It's rarely binary. It's rarely binary, yes or no. It's estimations. Our ability to apply estimations and probability into our decision making is very important. And as a critical care physician, it's difficult to do that because I like to be certain about what I'm doing, but I can't be. There is a roadmap for responsible introduction of machine learning into healthcare, but it really has two components. One is how usable it is to us at the bedside, and that's understandable. Can it be used to help make decisions? And can it change our behaviors in the way we practice because it's actionable? And the ability to sustain that depends on two important components: the system we create and how we think. What makes sense to us and what's adding to the complexity of care that we need to deliver. Just refer you to this paper. I think it's very useful to read by Azi Sadi at Sick Kids. It's a framework for introducing machine learning in healthcare, and in particular, how you can bring data, technology, and humans together, which is the essence that we need to do. So when I look at the A in intelligence, data to enable meaningful intelligence needs to align people with the data sources. It needs to be agile, and it needs to be actionable. And so when we are building out our platforms at Boston Children's, as they are at Sick Kids, building out our decision forests and decision trees, they're the three areas that we really are focusing on, and shifted away from thinking about artificial intelligence as some black box, but how do we utilize it meaningfully to the care we provide? Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, Peter, thank you once again for a brilliant talk that was inspirational without losing touch with reality. And I know that you've been passionate, throughout your career about how people and systems work together, and you made it clear that AI is just a continuation of that, interaction. I want to give priority to a couple of questions in the chat because, I trust that the people here in the room will have a chance to ask even after 9 o'clock. So there was one question about, what have we learned from the pandemic times that, changed the way we operate, changed the way we perhaps use AI, and how can we make some of that more sustainable?
That's a very important question. What we learned from the pandemic is that we are not a very reliable healthcare system. The data we acquired during the pandemic has been used to do retrospective analyses by many different people, epidemiologists, to then look at what we should have done and blame people because they didn't do it. That's using artificial intelligence as a weapon. I don't agree with it. What's changed for us at Boston Children's, and I'm sure it's the same here as well, is that we flew the plane, we built the plane as we were flying it at the start of COVID. I'm sure you're all familiar with that type of analogy. And then the second, post-COVID, well, still in COVID, but then you add behavioral health, you add the workforce massive shifts that we have seen. We reactivated our emergency management systems and we flew the plane that we built. And we did that pretty well, but then you go to the end of last year where we had the surge of viral illness on top of all the other things that we're managing. And we shifted to, we flew the plane we built, but we had to build the navigation. And the navigation within that was the use of data. We had a much better insight onto our capacity occupancy, our access, transfers, deferrals, where people were going and why. We actually predicted for the Northeast when we'd peak on, through machine learning models with one of their teams, when we'd peak for RSV, then when we'd peak for influenza, and they were spot on. And the reason that helped us is we could then say to everybody, guys, this is going to come to an end. This is the time frame in which we're working. But we could actually, it really helped us manage our system a lot better. So it's been an iterative process. More to go.
More questions from the audience here. I'm going to make an executive decision to go a little bit over time. We actually built some time into Peter's schedule this morning. So questions from the audience, yeah, I'd be happy to pass the mic around. Dimitri.
Thanks so much for that very thought-provoking and optimistic talk. I love your perspective that it's not volume-driven, but there's really all of these other systems. A part of making the data agile and actionable is teaching people how to utilize the AI. How is that being integrated at your institution, and how do you, especially in a time when everyone feels stretched, how do you add this new skill, which could potentially be dangerous if we are not teaching it properly, how to use it?
Very important question. First of all, it's extraordinarily hard to do right now, just to implement it and drop it in on people and say, hey, use this, this is going to make you better. That takes a lot of training, simulation, and time. In fact, I think in our current state, we're not going to see a lot of change very quickly, but it's going to reach an inflection point that will become an expectation. Where this needs to start is in the medical schools and residency training, nursing schools. It becomes part embedded within their expectations of the way they're going to deliver care. So change is slow, inexorable, and will rapidly reach a transition point.
Thanks, Peter. That was amazing. I kind of want to follow up on that because I think that asking medical schools and residencies to do it has an implication that it's actually me learning it first to then empower the students. So then how does that leap work?
Well, first of all, the students are the digital natives, right? So they're going to expect it, and it makes sense for them. And we then have to create a system that enables them to utilize that information. It's not them driving it per se. There's still perspective, experience, knowledge that has to be gained through training and exposure. That doesn't change. So I think it's going to create different ways in which we are caring for patients, though. I think the just-in-time understanding is going to be much more likely. We'll have core knowledge and then acquired knowledge by knowing where to go to get that knowledge, the sources. And just-in-time learning, just-in-time training, just-in-time use of data will be available at the bedside in all the care that we provide.
Thanks so much. As a pulmonologist, I have to say the lung is pretty good too, not just the myocardium. But I just want to ask you, how do you achieve togetherness? Because it sounds really good. And it's almost like, I don't want to be offensive, it's almost like a corporate statement. We're like together. We've heard this so many times, you know. But what do you think can help with that or make that happen?
So please, I'm not trying to be corporate here. I am not. I'm probably one of the least corporate people you'll ever meet in that regard. But I understand what you say. It's easy to say. So togetherness gets to the culture that you create, and the culture has to be one of what you expect, and how what we expect, how you expect you can behave, but also how you expect other people to behave, and that's generational. It's based on just a continual evaluation of that safety that people feel within their environment to speak up, and that they don't feel risk personally to what they're doing. So how do we get there? Has been continual discussion around it, continual like high reliability. We're just about to launch HRO 2.0. Now, a lot of people will glaze over, and that's okay. People always glaze over in certain aspects. But if you continue the conversation, that's really important. And then there has to be some really tangible things. We actually have 3 or 4 different programs right now looking at all of the things that really get in people's way to deliver care and trying to get rid of them. So reimagining the way we deliver care is important. So I have to be very intentional. I wish there was just one thing I could do, but I can't. It builds over time. I do believe in it, though, and I do believe in the myocardium.
All right. We have time for perhaps one more question in the chat, and I'm just going to read it out. Please address care affordability in looking into the future. How do we need to adjust and reform the infrastructure, for example, large academic centers, which adds major costs and access issues for patients versus increasing virtual and hub-and-spoke care contacts to make these improvements?
It's another lecture in of itself, but it's very, very important, and efforts are underway to try and do that, to break down those barriers. I think it's a problem of both our models for delivering care, our reimbursement models, and it's also one of breaking down the silos that exist within academic health systems, understanding their importance, but also understanding that there's a community aspect to this, a health equity component to this, that it's very important as well. And there is some really fundamental decisions that will be made at a societal level as to the expectations around the care that's being delivered. AI, the work at care at home, that's where things are going to head for sure. And as we continue to see new developments in the field of pulmonology, if you look at what's happened with cystic fibrosis, I mean, that's just an astounding story, really, what's happened to those patients and their care they provide. That's going to continue with all sorts of rare disease cohorts and other less rare conditions. Their treatment is going to change considerably, and it will be expensive. So those discoveries are applied at academic health systems, and translate across the healthcare system. The cost for doing that is not driven by a healthcare academic system, it's driven by pharmacy, it's driven by all other sorts of providers in that mix. So it will take time for this to shake out, but it's in its early stages. Thank you.
I reluctantly close this session. Peter, thank you very much again for your vision, which I think we all agree is so much more powerful to come from a clinician who lives the system, but also somebody who's got the higher level overview. Thank you very much for gracing us with your visit this week. And with that, we adjourn the Grand Rounds. Thank you.
Thank you very much.